Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. We're going to start off our program today by discussing Kashmir. Now, Black Lives Matter, Palestinian, Indigenous, and Rohingya, as well as a whole host of other activists of other significant causes around the world, have come out in support of people in Indian-occupied Kashmir, and they've called for, quote-unquote, a global spotlight on their suffering and resistance, end quote. This is all at the one-year anniversary, which just passed by, at the revocation of the Kashmir region's autonomy by the Indian government. Now, that had created and has created significant difficulties for Kashmiris at this time. Ever since then, we've had communications blackouts. Kashmiris have very limited access to the internet and to the outside world as well, as India keeps insisting everything is fine within that region. But of course, it isn't. Then there's also, of course, the issue of self-determination of these people in that region. And it's also really important to see the sort of similarities that exist in, for example, and I'll just throw this one example out there about Israel-Palestine, for example, and possibly the occupation of the lands of Palestine by the Israelis and the way that they may be certain parallels there, as well as the difficulties that the Rohingya people are going through, the Black Lives Matter and their entire cause to, of course, stand up for people, minorities of all sorts, people of color of all sorts around the world. And, of course, indigenous rights, activists have for a very long time been speaking up about several causes. And even myself, I've attended several conferences in Canada where indigenous people have come and spoken in favor, of course, of the cause of Kashmir, as well as Palestine and other causes also. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're now joined by Robert Fantina, who is an author, activist, and journalist. He serves on the board of Canadians for Peace and Justice in Kashmir. His latest book is Propaganda, Lies, and False Flags, How the U.S. Justifies Its Wars. He's joining us this morning from Kitchener, Ontario, in Canada. Joining us from Ashland, Virginia, is Michael R. Fischbach, who is a professor of history at Radolf-Macon College. He researches land and property ownership in connection with Israel-Palestine and the Arab-Israeli conflict, as well as how the latter impacts the Black Freedom Movement, or had impacted the Black Freedom Movement, I should say. And joining us from Washington, D.C. this morning is Nouf, who is a clinical assistant professor at Loyola University, Maryland. She's a Kashmiri American, and her clinical work, research, and advocacy focuses on trauma, torture, grief, and loss with survivors of war, violence, and persecution. Nouf, Michael, and Robert, good morning to all three of you, and thank you for your time today. Robert, let me start with you. How important is solidarity across these many causes for each of them, and of course, in this case, for Kashmir?
It's vitally important that these organizations join together because while the sources of their oppression are different, in Kashmir it's India, in Israel it's Palestine, in Palestine it's Israel, in the United States it's the U.S. government, many other places, but the oppression is the same. It is a denial of people's basic individual rights, denial of their human rights, seeing them as less somehow than equal to the governing body that is oppressing them. By uniting together, they not only publicize their cause and bring it to the forefront of international attention more, they also are able to grow from each other and learn from each other, and there is strength in numbers. So this solidarity is vitally important.
And what are your thoughts on that? Because again, for many people on the outside, it would seem like, these are all very individual causes, right? Which don't necessarily all link up, at least to the naked eye.
Well, historically and in the present, it's been important. And certainly some of the things I researched about the United States in the 1960s. In the 1960s, there was a real sense of internationalism globally, what we speak of the global 60s. And it certainly represented people of color transnationally seeing other conflicts and other issues and liberation struggles as their own and linking up with those people. And certainly in the 21st century, we've seen an extension of this idea, the concept of intersectionality, where various people, whether you're talking about LGBTQ people, women, peoples of color, dispossessed people, seeing themselves as part of a global struggle. Really, on the one hand, there are the haves, and the other, the have-nots. On the one hand, you have these global gated communities with fences and police forces and the military protecting those in power, and those on the other side of the fence. And I think a lot of people around the world, in what might seem to be very disparate situations, feel a real sense of commonality. They understand at a gut level what it's like to be on the other side of the fence, facing the tear gas and facing the guns.
Yeah. Nouf, as you well know, of course, and we're showing images as we've been talking to the other guests as well about, that those opposing rallies, for example, in New York at Times Square, and we had this whole issue and controversy, as you probably know, about the billboards there, and and the entire celebration of what happened when it comes to the Ram Mandir over the Babri Mosque, site as well. All of the above is important as well, and I wonder what you make of this sort of solidarity too between these different causes, as I put to our other guests, with Kashmir, and how this may then help its internationalization, if I may use that term.
Oh, absolutely. I agree with both of the speakers so far. I find the solidarity movements to be really deeply important and inspiring, because although there are differences between a lot of these different issues, like both speakers already spoke about, there's so many similarities and so many commonalities. And, particularly with the Kashmir issue, it is really important that it is internalized, that it is internationalized, in your own words, because for so long, India has tried to make it an internal issue when it's not. I think another really important point, though, about these solidarity movements is the centering of Kashmiri voices globally. Because for far too long, Kashmiris have been spoken about, they've been talked about, and we haven't been centering their voices. We haven't been hearing about their own struggles, their own resistance, in their own words, and how it's affected their communities, how they see it. And so a lot of these solidarity movements have been so important at putting some of these Kashmiri voices really at the forefront.
And that's a very good, isn't it, Robert? Because that seems to be my experience as well. When we're speaking about any of the above causes, right? So if you're speaking about Black Lives Matter, for example, in other parts of the world, for example, in parts of Asia, there might be disconnect with that, right? And if you're speaking about Kashmir, for example, in some Western countries, there might be disconnect there where you may not have as much of a diaspora of South Asians. Do you think that there is that issue of also of ignorance, possibly on the part of a greater part of the population?
I think that's definitely an issue, and these demonstrations and the solidarity movement is starting to bridge that education or that knowledge gap, as people are seeing that, yes, there is a definite link between the oppression of the Kashmiri people and in Kashmir and the oppression of black citizens in the United States. There is a link between these and the oppression of the Palestinians, the oppression of the Rohingyas. These are all related. And as people learn about this, again, someone might, as you mentioned, someone might think, well, this doesn't really relate to me. This doesn't relate to my struggle. And yet it does. As people gain more information, they see the similarities. They see that it is an oppressive government, either a nation's own government, as in the United States, or a foreign government, as in Kashmir and Palestine, that is oppressing them greatly, depriving them of their basic human rights, violating international law. So as people learn more, they see that, yes, what these people are suffering is the same thing that I'm suffering. And by doing so, they join together, and the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, that it strengthens as one movement becomes strengthened in solidarity with another, all the movements become strengthened.
Michael, I wanted to get more specific if we can for a moment. If we're speaking about Israel and India and their relationship right now, right? There's been talk about how India may possibly be in some way learning from the example of Israel and how it's acted in the occupied territories. Now, of course, it's not an exact parallel, but nevertheless, there are comparisons sometimes made there between how India may be acting in Kashmir in that regard. Do you think that there's an argument to be made that there's almost solidarity also between, or in between, if I may use this term loosely, oppressors, and they're sort of uniting together as well and giving each other lessons on how to do it better? I mean, I know that sounds odd, but is there some logic there to that argument? All right, it seems we must connect with Michael. Nouf, let me go to you with that question then. The relationship between Israel and India, respectively towards Palestine and Kashmir, do you think there's an argument to be made there about lessons being learned both ways?
Oh, absolutely. And I think even beyond, I think it's been well documented as well, the different ways in which the Israeli government and military has been training India in a lot of its same mechanisms of subjugating a population. And so, I mean, again, these are all things that have been very well documented and things that really don't come as a surprise to Kashmiri. I mean, to Kashmiris who are living in Kashmir right now, this has just been their reality now for decades. Really, again, just predating the August 5th revocation of Article 370. And so the parallels are, there's so many parallels.
Indeed. And I'll give you the final word before I let the three of you go. Do you think that there are parallels there, Michael, between, India, Kashmir, as well as Israel, Palestine?
Yes, absolutely. Almost too numerous to enumerate specifically, but certainly when you have states, when you have regimes whose raison d'etre is, whether it's stated or in de facto or de jure, to protect the interests of one ethno-religious people, one is bound to have trouble. But as I said earlier, I think certainly for the ordinary person in Palestine, the ordinary person in Kashmir, the idea that for whatever reason is motivating them, that the power of the state, a militarized force, fences, tear gas, bullets, this creates an immediate sense of commonality beyond the wider issues involving, ethnic-oriented states.
All right, Rob, being told that you wanted to say something as well. We have about 30 seconds. Go ahead.
Just very briefly, the model that the brutal model that Israel is using against Palestine is definitely an example for India. In November of last year, Sandy Chakravarty, who is India's consul general to New York City, said we have a model. He said, quote, "I don't know why we don't follow it. It has happened in the Middle East. If the Israeli people can do it, we can also do it." Very clearly, India plans to follow the oppressive Israeli model.
All right, we'll leave there as a final word, but we appreciate all three of our guests for getting up early in the morning at their respective time zones and speaking to us and sharing their thoughts with us on this important solidarity, right? As we've spoken about between Black Lives Matter, Rohingya, Palestinian, and now Kashmiri activists, as well as a host of other activists for other important causes, including indigenous and all of the above. It's important to see that, of course, they are all individually different causes, but nevertheless, there are links between them. As I said to at least a couple of our guests, the link between India and Israel at this time, the growing links and the very open links, right? As Robert there right at the end said, we've had Indian officials who have very openly said, we want to implement an Israel model when it comes to Kashmir. Why shouldn't we? And then that is very troubling if you think about it, because it seems that on top then they're united. And so why shouldn't we all be united at the bottom to ensure, in fact, that everybody across the board has their human rights respected, as well as their freedoms, self-determination, all of the above, that we all see as our human rights anywhere else in the world also being respected and implemented. I'll be back after my break with the next segment. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, in this segment, we're going to continue to discuss what happened in Lebanon, specifically, of course, that explosion in Beirut. And, of course, we now know that 16 people are currently under house arrest of sorts as Lebanese authorities investigate what exactly went wrong. Now, we know, of course, ammonium nitrate, as I'd mentioned in yesterday's show, had been sitting in this port for around 6 years and hadn't been dealt with. Now, it's known that this is an explosive material, of course, so why wasn't this dealt with? All of that, one can imagine, is being investigated at this time. The 16 people, as I said, currently under investigation, currently under house arrest. The number, as we're recording right now, is 157, I believe, dead and around 5,000 injured. The damage, of course, is very widespread. We've seen satellite images of that. We've heard from Lebanese themselves whose apartments, whose lives have been shattered because of this event. And of course, just the effect that this is having. At the same time, grassroots movements are coming out across the city, across the country, and across the world, really, as well, with people coming out in solidarity with the Lebanese people at this time also. But nevertheless, the question remains, will there be proper accountability at this time? This is as, of course, the international community's pressure is also growing on the country, with the French president making his trip as the first foreign leader to visit the country after this event and putting pressure then on Lebanese authorities to clean up their act. Let's put all of those issues to our esteemed panelists who are joining us now to discuss this further. We're now joined by Carmen Geha, who is an associate professor of public administration. She's joining us from Beirut. Also joining us from Beirut is Yara, who is a researcher on social movements and contentious politics, in the Middle East. She's the regional strategy manager for Middle East and North Africa region at Friedrich Naumann Foundation. And joining us from Jounieh in Lebanon as well is Vanessa, Bassil, who is the founder and president of the Media Association for Peace, known by its abbreviation MAP. Vanessa, Carmen, and Yara, thank you to all three of you for your time today. Carmen, let me start with you. As I did yesterday as well, I think it's important to start off with just the human angle, right? Just tell our viewers, if you can, briefly about how this has affected you yourself and those around you at this event.
Yeah, I mean, I can't begin to tell you. And when Lebanese people tell you it's nothing like anything we've seen a lot. We've never seen anything like it. And I just want to say, if you want to help, the news and the story, don't even mention the Lebanese authorities. The Lebanese authorities caused this. I don't care if they're going to put some low-life civil servant under house arrest. All our politicians knew who managed the port and what was in the port, and they used our bodies, our city, our stores, our homes as human shields. You want to know the mood right now? It's rage beyond words. They buried people alive. We're still burying our dead, and the city will never rise again. No amount of aid. The only support we need is to isolate the politicians that knew that this was being stored there. They sent firefighters to their grave. They assassinated an entire group of firefighters by sending them to the initial fire. There's no human side of this. There's only rage. If you want to help isolate them. They are the ones responsible. Activists are saying no investigation. They cannot investigate. The criminals that caused it can't be the ones investigating this.
Vanessa, what are your thoughts about this event and how it's affected those who you know?
Knowing that very close people to me are actually affected by this explosion, and knowing also that a lot of victims have also not only, I mean, the martyrs, I would say, not only victims, I would say that martyrs, this is really something that we cannot bear as Lebanese, particularly that we are already going through a lot with our government. And we have started a revolution last year, at the end of last year, to particularly say no, say enough to the political system. And what's happening today is only a consequence of the government, of the bad acts of the government, the incompetence, the negligence. We're deeply hurt, we're deeply angry and furious, just as my colleague is saying. Like, we are all feeling the same. We are disgusted by this government. We are so angry, and we really want everyone to be held accountable, not only the ones that are responsible of this explosion, but all the political leaders in the country.
And before I get to the politics, I just want to get your thoughts as well about how this has affected you and those around you.
Going live now from my partially destroyed apartment. We don't have glass, we don't have doors anymore. I feel lucky that my parents weren't affected. We had small injuries at home. We are still under shock of what happened. I tried to isolate myself today because we're still hearing sounds of like ambulance, of people cleaning the streets, so I can be able to talk to you. This is a shock for us, and this investigation that is happening, just like anything that the Lebanese government offered in the last few years, we're not buying it anymore. There was chemical material, explosive material, not even next to the city, in the city of Beirut. We were so lucky that the city wasn't completely destroyed or covered by water. This is something that we cannot accept as Lebanese people, and even as the international community should see what happened to the Lebanese people because of the reluctance and the corruption of the officials in Lebanon. The political repercussions are like, at this moment, are secondary, because the humanitarian crisis is very deep, and it's very like a country that is going through an economic crisis, a country that is the people lost all their money in their banks. Yeah. The COVID-19, like, what can you say to these people that now is that they have to step out of their places, although they were supposed to be on a lockdown because of the number of cases of COVID-19 were rising. They need to go out to clean their city. Like, it's beyond words. It's beyond my what words can express. What you see in the streets, you cannot see it. Like, you cannot even imagine seeing Beirut like this, even during a war. That's what I said to my dad. I told him, if we were in a war, I would know myself. Like, there's an enemy that I need to fight. I will be fighting, I will be protecting my place. And I would die for protecting my place. But like this, just being in an office, just being at home, like, this is not acceptable.
Carmen, I wanted to jump right into, also the international reaction to all this, right? We've had Macron, the French president, visit Lebanon, and, he did quite openly say that the Lebanese authorities need to clean up their act. Of course, I'm paraphrasing his words. If they do want, for example, French help or international help, he's also promised an aid conference of some sort. Do you think that all of this will result eventually in the kinds of reforms that the governing system needs to make in the country?
This is a country that politicians don't pick up the garbage, and when they pick up the garbage, they throw it in the sea. This is a country with no fuel, with no electricity. 40 billion is the losses in the electricity sector, and this was all pre-bomb. There is no reform. No, I'm telling you, they are not authorities. They are criminals. If you want to help, the shout out to the world is help individual people. Sponsor somebody's office, sponsor somebody's hospital bill, sponsor someone's funeral. Help the Lebanese people directly. We're being taken hostage. It's beyond imagination. No reform, nothing. I mean, I welcomed Mr. Macron's, condemning them, etc. But now we have to do it on our own. We have to set up the system that would get aid to people who need it, to the ones who are still alive. And then we want revenge. There is no faith in any justice in this system. No, nothing. There's no rule of law.
Okay, so, Vanessa, within that French president's, trip, there's also, and I know it's a very small petition, I don't want to make overstate it, but there is a petition as well which says something along the lines of, that the country should go back under French mandate for the next 10 years. I mean, at this time, at least, I believe around 58,000, 60,000 people might have signed that petition. Again, I'm not trying to give it too much importance, but nevertheless, that goes to show again, right, that the distrust the Lebanese have in their own government. But nevertheless, do you think that something within this system or that reforms are on the horizon of some sort? Is there any optimism?
Well, actually, what we really want is to change the whole system. I do not think that the reforms at this point will serve anything. I think the whole political system of Lebanon has to be reconsidered. And I do not maybe agree on calling for a mandate, but this actually shows how much people are desperate. And they reach a point where they just want any support from any place, from any country, because we do not trust our government and we do not believe that the government is going to do any change. As I said before, we have started a revolution to particularly call for the change of the political system and to hold accountable all our politicians. And nothing happened since the revolution started. So now we reach a point where actually we do not want the whole system. We do not want any political leader to keep governing. We really want to see a true change. We want to see a deep change. And this is not going to happen with the same political leaders governing. This is why we need new faces. We need youth. We need women. We need people with another mentality, another way of thinking, and people who have ethics and values, because the current political leaders do not have.
Yara, I'll give a final word before I let the three of you go. Again, back to this issue of France and the French president's, trip, as well as this petition and all of the above. I imagine this is a very sensitive time, right? Obviously, we know that there's been this huge tragedy in the country. A lot of people have been affected, certainly, and this has been a long-standing issue, legitimate grievances with the governing system. But how do we go step by step forward, right? I mean, I would think that nothing can change overnight.
I agree with you on this. Nothing can change overnight. Like it's a system that impacted Lebanon for 30 years now, and in different stages. What the French president came to say that, just like the foreign minister said before, help yourself so we can help you. He came with a recommendation or like a suggestion on a new national pact between the different Lebanese leaders. But what is needed now, and I think it wasn't said in an explicit way, but what is required now, I believe, is early elections. What is required now is like new faces presenting themselves as an alternative force to the existing political elite. This is the first step that should be taken. These early elections come with, of course, the election of a new president of the country and the formation of a technocratic government. Macron said it in an implicit way that Lebanon needs to be neutral from its surrounding and from the conflict that are happening around the region. Right. So that's why the Lebanese government should be focusing on reforms, should be focusing on citizens and their needs, on the Lebanese economy, on how to grow this economy, on how to provide social services, on how to rebuild the institutions and reform the institutions. Like, it's not the problem that we have now is not only that all Beirut is destroyed. Beirut was destroyed before. We only had buildings, but our institutions were empty. People who had, like, the term in Arabic is wasta, who had, like, people some political allegations, or they were heading major institutions. So now we need to work more on the merit. We need to have the right people in the right positions. What Macron came to say yesterday, I think he was calling for early elections, and these early elections will lead to a structural change within the country, and not a systematic one. It's too far-fetched for the moment.
Very well. We'll leave there as a word, but we do sincerely appreciate all three of our guests, Carmen, Vanessa, and Yara, for their time today. I know it's a difficult period for everybody there, and we appreciate them taking their time out of that to speak to us and share their thoughts with us about the latest situation in Lebanon, specifically in Beirut, of course, because of this explosion. The fallout continues. We have these 16 people right now under house arrest, as I mentioned, 157 dead, 5,000 injured as well. But with this lack of confidence right now that is being expressed in this government, and people looking inwards, ages towards their own selves to fix the situation, as well as the international community, where then does this leave any governing structure that currently is in place in Lebanon? What happens next? That's the major question, because it's a sensitive time, right? We don't want necessarily some other country from the outside swooping in and possibly, not taking the interests of the country's people into play. This time you need somebody in power who's doing what's right for the country, not just for some other country's national interests. Although, of course, as we all know, this system that's currently in place has major issues, mismanagement, corruption, and all of the above. I'll be back after this break with my next thing. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss algorithms and how they affect visa applications in the UK. Organizations, they're saying that the algorithm that was in use, the UK government has now paused that system seemingly, was racially biased. Now, for those of us like myself who are not experts when it comes to AI and exactly how those sorts of things work, hearing about an algorithm being racially biased sounds kind of odd, doesn't it? But nevertheless, this is seemingly quite an important issue in many regards, because even in places like the United States, we have police that use algorithms to try to figure out if somebody will possibly commit a criminal act of some sort later on in their life or in the near future. And many of those times, those are also seen as being racist and racially biased as well. So what exactly is it about these algorithms? Is it the way that they're set up, et cetera, that creates this sort of situation where they are then unhelpful, in fact, in the very goal that they're meant to be achieving? Let's put that now to our panelists. We're joined now by Melissa Hamilton, who is the Reader of Law and Criminal Justice at the University of Surrey. She's joining us from London. Also joining us from the British capital is Areeq Chowdhury, who is the Director of Web Roots Democracy, which is a think tank focused on progressive and inclusive technology policy. Areeq and Melissa, thank you both for your time today. Melissa, let me start with you. As I said, for those of us like myself who are not complete experts in artificial intelligence, it sounds a bit odd to hear that an algorithm would necessarily be racially biased in and of itself. In your understanding, why exactly is that?
Yeah, so one of the myths about algorithms are that they're independent and they're scientific and therefore they can't have biases. But there's various ways that biases can get into algorithms. One of the ways is algorithms tend to be trained on data. Well, if that data is biased, then the algorithm is going to learn the bias and actually probably repeat the bias. So as an example, you had mentioned algorithms being used in a criminal justice context to try to predict who's going to reoffend. Well, these algorithms are based usually on historical data about offenders. And if, for example, the data set on which an algorithm learns is based on biased policing, for example, discriminatory policing based on race or gender or other socioeconomic status, then that algorithm is going to learn those biases and then reproduce the biases by predicting the same kinds of offenders will reoffend. And if you've got then a discriminatory data set, it's going to produce a discriminatory algorithm and results thereof.
So how does one get beyond this, right? I mean, in this case, to the UK government's, to the Home Office credit, it did make the decision to rescind, this visa algorithm process for visa applications, that is, before even a legal process was begun on it. But nevertheless, I would imagine then algorithms in use around the world do still have this sort of negative side to them.
Yeah, so the Home Office only really steps back away from it because of the actions of campaigners who highlighted these kind of biases and asked them to stop using it. The way you get around it is, like Melissa said, you can look at the data and consider whether there are things within the data set which are already biased, and are there ways to balance that out. Another option is to consider the context in which you're deploying that algorithm. So let's say for the criminal justice examples, what are you actually trying to achieve by using this new form of technology? Are you just simply trying to get costs down? Or are you trying to get more effective outcomes and then work backwards from that? And in some cases, it might be better to just not use these algorithms at all, because they might be proven to be ineffective in your goal and also inaccurate. One example I'm looking at the moment is facial recognition technology, and this is basically cameras that can detect wanted criminals within a crowd. And one of the issues there is that some of these technologies don't actually work as well on people with darker skin colors.
Right.
And therefore, you might actually get ineffective outcomes. You might be missing guilty people that you want to catch, and you also might be flagging up innocent people as criminals.
Melissa, being, comical instances in the past, right, where I believe it was a soap dispenser, if I'm not mistaken, a while back, which wouldn't dispense soap, I believe, in a public washroom to people of color, just to people of, white skin, and, those sorts of things. And that's not necessarily, obviously, as serious, certainly, as visa applications being rejected because of somebody's nationality. But nevertheless, I imagine that there's quite a slippery slope here, right, where even AI and its importance, as you said, for a lot of us is probably misunderstood as being completely neutral, but this will probably be still in place in many countries around the world, right? So we're possibly already living through the effects of this at this time?
That's correct. So algorithms are operating in a variety of contexts and around the world. One of the issues as well is, I had mentioned the historical data sets, if they're biased. But another way that these algorithms then can produce biases is if they are learned on only a segment of people, then they're going to learn what is. So if we go back to the criminal justice context, which is one I am most experienced in, is, for example, what we find for the criminal justice algorithms is mostly that they were learned on largely male samples. And if what the algorithm is trying to predict or trying to detect, if there's a relevant aspect to, for example, gender, and there is in criminal justice recidivism, then the algorithm is going to be much better at predicting males who reoffend than they were for females, because there are risk-relevant differences between genders. And so in the visa context in the UK, it could very well be that if most individuals who are trying to get visas into the UK are from, white upper-class countries, then that algorithm is going to learn best how to predict for that kind of race and as well as nationality. And so one of the things as well in terms of choosing whether to use the algorithm or not is a lot of experts say, well, but it's better than what? Is the algorithm then more accurate than humans who might be, determining whether somebody should get a visa? And we already know that there are human biases. Yeah. So in some sense, there's a trade-off potentially of what type of bias.
Areeq, final word before I let you both go. on this issue then of racial biases, how does one ensure this doesn't happen? Is it about having global regulations in place? Because I know that that's been something that's been spoken of for a while now, just when it comes to technology overall. I mean, just social media, for example. We know that the many issues with those tech giants such as Facebook, Twitter, and the others, but nevertheless, this all, I imagine, should have some sort of global regulations?
It doesn't necessarily need to be global. I think one thing we need is transparency in these systems. You mentioned some of the issues we have on social media. A lot of the focus is on Twitter because it's an open platform and researchers can go in and understand how that platform works and what things are going on that platform. When it comes to these AI algorithms in policing, especially in the visa applications, people will want to know why they've been rejected from these things or why they've been flagged up as a wanted criminal. And the problem with some of these algorithms is that they are produced by third-party private companies, and therefore their software is proprietary. It means that you can't just subject it to public scrutiny because it's commercially sensitive data. So that's one area to look at. The second thing is the people using it should also have some understanding of how these systems work, so that when it comes to appeals and scrutiny, we can actually know what it is that's going on. Because at the moment, the whole thing is kind of operating within a black box. And I think that's also what some of the critique of the visa application system is that when someone gets rejected, it's not very clear why it is that they've been rejected.
Very well. There's a final word, but we appreciate both Melissa and Areeq for shedding some insight into this issue for all of us. I believe, as I said to Areeq, that we probably do need some regulations, right, when it comes to this issue of AI, as well as, just technology overall around the world, and how it's being used or misused really by many players at this time, be it unfair monopoly, be it, privacy issues and et cetera, visa applications, criminal justice. Those are all very, very serious implications of any racial biases that may exist within algorithms. And all of this is, again, because of how the samples, as Melissa there was mentioning about, if you've had just, for example, white males, for example, examples for algorithms to use, moving forward, and that's all the algorithm will know. And that's what will be reflected then in the results as well. And we need that to change. We need more diversity in that regard as well. And we need to stop having these applications, for example, being rejected simply on the basis of somebody's nationality. It needs to go beyond that sort of thing to actual conditions that need to be met for somebody to be acceptable for a visa to any country really around the world. So there's many issues here, and it seems that this is all sort of being unregulated at this time, even though as Areeq there said, because of the pressure of activists and campaigners in the UK, the Home Office has now rescinded that visa algorithm process at this point in time and has promised that it will fix it. Will it do so? Is this a milestone, as some are at this time applauding? We'll have to wait and see on that. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.